It's been 2.5 months since the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, for the first time, we are hearing police officer Darren Wilson's account of the event. The New York Times, citing government officials briefed on the investigation, reports that, quote, he, meaning Officer Wilson, was pinned in his vehicle and in fear for his life. Mr. Brown reached for the gun. It was fired twice in the car. The first bullet struck Mr. Brown in the arm. Forensic tests showed Mr. Brown's blood on the gun, as well as on the interior door panel and on Officer Wilson's uniform.
It's a question that is easy to answer. Will this potentially impact the grand jury? The answer has to be yes. The question is how much and why. Let's ask Daryl Parks. He's an attorney for Michael Brown's family. Counselor, it's good to have you with us. What do you make of this situation? It's not completely news to you, I'm sure, but what do you think its impact should be?
Not at all, Chris. It's not news. Several problems here. Number one, as we continue to see various information leak into the public domain, it makes many people very weary of the whole process. And so you really wish these leaks would stop. However, the other part of this is that, without question, even this article supports that there exists probable cause to indict this officer for this shooting.
But Mr.
Clearly, yes, ma'am.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Parks. What does Michael Brown's family think of this information that the officer is saying that this all started because Michael Brown reached for the gun and the officer thought he was trying to get the gun?
Well, no, we've all knew all along that there was a struggle at the car that existed. Part of the problem in this case is how the initial interaction started anyway, as told by Dorian Johnson. That this officer came and the car almost hit Michael. And so they were arguing. They had an altercation at the car. Obviously, it escalated. And obviously, Michael was there, and the officer decided to pull his gun, and he shot Michael while Michael was at the car. What the difference here, though, is that once Michael left the car, the officer got out of the car and continued to shoot at Michael as he ran away. That's the difference here in this case.
Here's the concern, Counselor, as you know, but for the uninitiated, the non-lawyers who are watching us, if the officer reasonably believed and is backed up by forensics that show that Michael Brown was reaching for his gun and theoretically trying to use it, if that's what the powder burns and all the different forensic stuff shows, he would have a very different rationale for justification in his actions versus Michael Brown, especially as a police officer, which would include him exiting the car and still pursuing him with deadly force.
But, Chris, I think you have to back up a little bit there. Even before the officer makes that decision about pulling his gun, there was an altercation and a dispute that had to exist between Michael and the officer prior to him pulling the gun. The officer had to pull his gun, and so the officer and Mike had grabbed Michael. So Michael was defending himself at the car. So clearly, yes, this officer made a decision to pull his gun, but we got to remember now, that's not when Michael died. Michael died later as the officer got out of his car as Michael was running away from him, and the officer decided to shoot at him as he ran away. Michael stopped and tried to surrender to the officer, yet the officer continued to shoot.
Mr. Parks, what does the autopsy on Michael Brown's body show? Was there gun residue on his hands?
I can't address the gun residue issue, obviously, because we haven't gotten that level of testing back yet. Obviously, there was some injury that one of the 6 shots that Michael received had to have happened while he was at the car.
And why do you say that?
Well, if he was shot 6 times, and the officer has now, the officer is testifying that he shot Michael at least once while he was at the car, which is what the article said, and then the source of Michael being shot once by the officer is from the officer account that's given by the New York Times. I haven't talked to the officer.
Right. Look, the big concern will be, especially from your perspective, Counselor Parks, is that if Michael Brown was reasonably perceived by the officer to be trying to get his gun in a struggle with the officer and use it against him, he can now view him as an imminent threat to himself and to the community. Remember, he's a cop. He's not a regular person, and they have a different set of rules, and it really is going to come down to a very factual analysis. How do you think this is going to impact the grand jury? You think if this information comes, and it is somewhat supported by forensics, is an indictment less likely, in your opinion?
Well, it shouldn't be, Chris, because if nothing else, you have 2 competing stories here. It's not the grand jury's job to weigh that testimony. That job is for a normal jury. What this grand jury has is probable cause that he certainly shot Michael, and he could be liable for the murder of Michael. So The real situation is that he should be indicted at a minimum. And indicted only means that he should go to trial, and there should be a public trial. It's important in this case that we have a public trial of all the evidence. It's not fair to this family for leaks to weigh the information, a prosecutor to decide when the officer should testify in front of the grand jury or not testify, and what information they should get. It should be public. If it's public, then we all will know it's fair, and we'll know what was weighed and how the decision was made. Right now, it's being done in the vacuum, and it's totally unfair to this family and totally unfair to the general public.
Okay, Mr. Parks, thanks so much for joining us. We will see what the grand jury decides in the next few weeks.